Hello everyone, it's Simon Smart from the CPX podcast. I'm joined today by Greg Clark in Sydney, and we're also talking to John Harris, who's on the phone from his home in Canberra. It's a great privilege to have John here with us. John is the author of One Blood, a landmark study into 200 years of Aboriginal encounter with Christianity. He spent a long time as a teacher and school principal in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory of Australia, and has worked as a consultant in translation of the Bible into Aboriginal languages. John, thanks for speaking with us at CPX.
It's good to be talking to you, Simon.
John, sometimes people give the impression that the Church's engagement with Aboriginal people from the beginning was entirely negative. You don't hold that view, do you?
No, I don't actually. I think we have to be fair and judge people, according to their historic times, and perhaps from our vantage point of our education and the way society has developed in its understanding of itself, we might feel that we are more tolerant, less racist and so on than missionaries were a couple hundred years ago. But compared to the people of their times, they were the enlightened ones.
Right.
Well, the ones who were saying, Aborigines are human, we shouldn't be treating them as animals. Whereas some of their contemporaries were saying, they're below the human species.
John, it's Greg here. That's certainly not the reputation that missionaries often have. They're seen as the destroyers of Aboriginal culture. What happened in the translation of that information down the centuries?
Well, having said what I said, that didn't mean to say that missionaries didn't have a sense of superiority, as all white races, as all Europeans no doubt did in that time, and they even long before Darwin, for whom we kind of blame all this quite unfairly, long before Darwin there was this notion of what they called the chain of being, and Europeans were sort of somewhere at the top, although then they were graded. The English would have had themselves first, and then the French, and then the Germans, and then and the Irish, and then you'd start to go through the Asian races and so on, and Africa, and eventually at the bottom you get Aborigines. And so certainly missionaries thought that they were uplifting Aborigines, that is, that they were trying to help them to get from the bottom of the chain of being to get up a bit higher towards the place that the Europeans thought that they occupied. And of course we can now criticise that, but I still make the point that they put Aborigines on the chain of being. They said these are descended from Adam. In other words, these are our brothers and sisters in a way. And there were plenty of the opponents of mission in the early days in Australia who said Aborigines are below the level of the white man's species.
Reading One Blood, it felt to me like Christian contact with First Australians was both worse than and better than most people realised. Do you think that's a fair impression?
Yes, I think it's a fair impression because, we're at fault if we sort of generalise about history. So I suppose what we're really saying is that there were some people who just saw the terrible plight of Aborigines and just said, I just want to go and help them, I just want to do my best. And by the lights of their time, by their understandings of the time, they did the best they could. And Aboriginal people often came to love and respect those people and to take the opportunity of the good that those people did to them. On the other hand, of course, there were missionaries who were people of very authoritarian, who saw that the Aboriginal people were people who had to be forced into certain patterns of behaviour. And so, you've got a mixture, and it's very hard to generalise, and probably we do history a disservice if we generalise about all missionaries. And so you make a good point that we see both the best of Christianity and probably some of the worst of Christianity as well in the way different missionaries reacted.
John, it's Greg here. How much was the missionary activity really generated out of their Christian faith, and how much can we say it was just sort of the empire moving forward? It was really colonialism.
Well, that's again an interesting question. There were certainly missionaries who saw themselves as agents of empire, but there was certainly the opposite as well. I think of the famous John Gribble in Western Australia.
He's a great figure, yeah. Tell us about him.
Well, John Gribble was forever fighting against the landed gentry, against the pastoralists, against those who mistreated and abused Aboriginal people. And in the end, he was kind of tarred and feathered and put out of Western Australia by the powers, many of whom are still named people in the hierarchy of Western Australia today, whose names people would know. And he was continually saying, this is a blot on the British Empire. These Aboriginal people are being treated in an un-British way. Britain is not a country that should be abusing or mistreating her citizens. And it's quite an interesting thing. There were various times in Australian history before Aboriginal people were recognised as citizens, which wasn't until the 1960s, that there were attempts by Aboriginal people to have their rights asserted by the British Crown. And it was an interesting question. They may not be Australian citizens, but they would certainly be legally held to be British subjects. And perhaps I stray there, but what I was saying was that people like John Gribble said these people are under the Crown, they're British subjects, and they don't have the freedoms and benefits of being British subjects.
John, colonial Australia seemed to me to mix up the idea of Christianity with European civilization as if they were just one and the same thing. That brought big problems, didn't it?
Yes, it did indeed, and it's not just missionaries in Australia. I mean, the big ethical and theological debate that went through all of the 19th century was exactly that. Is Christianising the same as Europeanising? And certainly missionaries, or the church in general, Christians in general, were probably guilty of thinking that along with faith in God through Jesus, there was also a kind of lifestyle that went along with it. And so therefore part of teaching people knowledge of God as expressed in Christ was also helping those people to adopt the lifestyle that they mistakenly thought had to go along with it.
It's always funny, John, seeing pictures of the clothing that Aboriginal people are wearing when the missionaries are involved. It was as if wearing white clothes brought you closer to God or something.
Well, that's right. And of course, Aboriginal people, I mean, sometimes they're forced to do that, but sometimes they wanted to do that. In other words, they saw it as aligning themselves with the missionaries. So I'm going to start behaving like one of them, so I'll wear clothes like one of them, and so on. I mean, it's in South Australia, there's a whole treatise by one of the bishops there who felt that the missions had achieved great things once he was able to go to one of the mission stations and see all the Aboriginal lads playing cricket in their whites.
Well, it is the game played in heaven.
He felt that the kingdom of God had arrived because they could play cricket, he said, as well as any English gentleman.
Indeed. John, the second half of the 19th century was the time when Darwinian theory lent scientific respectability to the belief of European superiority. How well did the Christians challenge that notion with their own concept of image of God?
Well, I don't think they challenged it very well. I think that Christians did not challenge Darwinism in those years, or social Darwinism. It's hard here to sort of be critical and apportion blame. It's almost as if we're asking ordinary Christian people to be on some kind of front line of evolutionary theory and being able to sort of challenge the scientific minds of the day, and that takes a long time. And I think that there'd be more likelihood of ordinary Christian folk, including Christian clergy, including missionaries, to go along with what the great minds of the day were telling you was the truth. And so, yes, I think there was an acceptance of certainly of social Darwinism, as opposed to biological evolution, which is a different matter because that challenged the notion of creation. But social Darwinism did not challenge the notion of creation, and so therefore I think ordinary Christian people went along with the academics of the day, well, John, as we might today.
One of the let's bring it up to the present now. Yeah, one of the recent acts, at least of the previous government, the Howard government, was the intervention in the Northern Territory, which seems to be an act of great control, or perhaps sort of cultural intervention, I guess is the right word. Have you got a view on what's going on there at the moment and whether this is a good thing for Aborigines in the Northern Territory?
Well, in a word, what what is happening is heavy-handed and being done without sufficient consultation. I thought I'd better say that because once I start talking, I mightn't get to put in a nutshell what I think. It is true that in some, particularly of the more remote, isolated Aboriginal communities, there's been a breakdown of law and order and of discipline. This is not just a breakdown in terms of Western or Australian law, but a breakdown of tribal law and everything else. And there are certainly people that we know well, pedophiles and others, who took advantage of the distance from law to perpetrate some bad things. But the communities that I've recently visited, such as Ngooker, on the Roper River, the people say, well, the intervention is punishment. We're being punished because some other Aboriginal people somewhere did the wrong thing. And an interesting, very, very interesting to me, insight into just what they thought about the intervention was when I was at Ngooker. They've got a women's shelter and a men's shelter built under the intervention, either end of the village, barbed wire fences, steel buildings that are indestructible in which you can lock drunks and everything. And I got there, I don't know, a few months after the buildings had been constructed, and I said to an old lady who was showing me around some of the new things in the road, because I hadn't been there for a long time. She showed me this building, and I said, anybody been locked up in this yet? And she said, oh, no, nobody's been locked up in it yet. She said, we think that if they took down the barbed wire fence, it would make a good preschool. Now, you see, no one asked them what was the most important thing to do in their village. The government thought the most important thing to do was to lock up the drunks. But they thought the most important thing to do was to protect the next generation before they lost them to petrol sniffing and substance abuse. And so they thought, what we should be doing here is something for the children. Now, I'm not saying the government won't eventually help them do something for the children, but the government never really asked Aboriginal people. They didn't even ask the Aboriginal Medical Service, which is the association of Aboriginal medical practitioners of Aboriginal descent. They didn't even ask them what they ought to do. So it was heavy-handed, and it was without due consultation with the very people who had to try and make this happen, which is the good, clean, living, decent Aboriginal people that are found in every Aboriginal place.
John, if we return to some of this brutal past, Australia's colonial past, you've said that some of the best moments of Christian support for Aboriginal people came at times of community agitation around massacres like the Mile Creek incident, that infamous moment. What shape did that sort of support take?
Well, there was certainly a lot of outspokenness. And the people who, in the Mile Creek massacre, you know, the most outspoken people were people of Christian faith who spoke out because of their Christian faith. And they weren't just people like Archbishop Poling, you know, or John Saunders or others who were Christian clergy, although they spoke out greatly. One Aboriginal soul, said Archbishop Poling, is worth more than all the cattle on the Bathurst Plains.
That's a great quote.
Yeah, but also, and pardon me because in this interview his name slips my mind, but the prosecuting attorney, was he called Attorney General then? I don't know. He was the one who brought the Mile Creek case to court again on further evidence when it was thrown out the first time, because of his committed Christian belief that great moral injustice had been done. And it was in Christian terms that he sought to redress this. And so I think that Christians, when it came to the point, they might have wanted to change Aboriginal people into some kind of, you know, black Europeans, but they did not believe that they deserved death. They did not believe that we should treat them as subhuman. And so that's where the big distinction lay.
Does that come out of the thinking that gave you the title of your book, One Blood?
Well, of course, it came from a verse in the Bible, from Acts chapter 17, which said in the old version, in the authorised version, God hath made of one blood all nations of man to dwell upon the face of the earth. Now, that's not how we'd phrase it today, but the thing that interested me was that this phrase, one blood, was written in almost every missionary's journal that I ever read, sometimes on the front page and sometimes underlined. These people are with us of one blood, that we are all human.
And that marked them as very distinct from some of the rest of the stuff we read from that time. There were some exceptionally honourable people, weren't there? You've uncovered some great stories. You mentioned John Gribble. I think of Daniel Matthews and his wife Janet, who...
That's true, yes.
Really, they worked so hard, didn't they, on behalf of Aboriginal people?
Well, that's right, and they were people who just saw the injustice and decided to do something about it. Matthews was a very big, physical, muscular, black-bearded man, worked in his father's ship chandler's shop at Echuca when there's a lot more water in the Murray to have an actual ship supplier. And he just was appalled at the way Aboriginal people were treated, and he used to go physically into the timber cutters' camps and so on and remove Aboriginal girls at 9, 10, 11 years old who were being held captive there, and just simply do it by his physical presence and his physical aggressive prowess. And he, in a sense, put his body on the line for Aboriginal people as well as his faith.
Yeah, it's a great story.
The same could be said of John Brown Gribble and many others.
Well, John, coming up to today now, Aboriginal issues are obviously a sort of shifting focus in Australian society. Sometimes there seems to be a lot of focus on them, other times there's very little at all. Just this week, Dr. Peter Adam, principal of the Bible College down in Melbourne, presented a lecture arguing that European Australia had really committed a gross crime against Aboriginal people, and we owed them recompense and apology and repentance, and we needed to make costly restitution for this. I don't know if you've had a chance to hear that lecture or hear some of the press around it, but are you of that view that there's still a great deal of repentance and restitution that needs to take place?
These are loaded words, aren't they? And I think that there are many Aboriginal people who do not want to be perpetual victims. I think we need to understand the past. I think we need to acknowledge the sins of our forebears. And I think we need to be in dialogue with Aboriginal people about how we can go forward together. I mean, I don't know whether you've seen the book that I helped the Aboriginal people of Mooka write about themselves. But there's a brilliant sentence in the introduction there of the four Aboriginal people who edited it, wrote. They said, "We no longer carry the past as a burden." And I think we have to help Aboriginal people not to carry the past as a burden. Of course, there are going to be politically active Aboriginal people who will have every right to have their voices heard. And of course, there are damaged Aboriginal people who alcoholic or substance abusing people who, it doesn't matter what colour or race they are very difficult to heal and to help to wholeness of life. So there are still huge problems, but we need to be looking to Aboriginal people to tell us how to empower them to improve their lot and their life within the Australian community.
John, the government's apology seemed a symbolically significant moment. How optimistic are you that it signals a step towards real change for Aboriginal people?
I think that it's something that mattered hugely. I think that John Howard was very wrong in not being willing to mouth the words. I don't think probably perhaps I can't try, and it's unfair to say what I think his motives were, but I think one of them was he thought there was a price tag, and I think it's been shown since then that, there hasn't suddenly been millions of dollars having to be spent on Aboriginal people just because Kevin Rudd said sorry. And I think the power of that was that there were a huge number of people who had wanted to hear an acknowledgement of the unfairness of that immediate past of their parents and their grandparents. I'm not really talking about here the initial settlement of Australia, but the incarceration of Aboriginal children and the children's homes and all that kind of thing.
The stolen
people
generation.
wanted to hear someone say, "It happened and we're sorry." And really, that was a huge landmark, and that will go down as one of the great speeches of history. You know, I guarantee that in 50 years, 100 years' time, and you get a book that's got some of history's great speeches in it, it'll have Churchill and blood, sweat and tears, and it'll have, I have a dream, and it's going to have sorry in it as well. And it's one of the great speeches, and it has great significance.
It's so rare to hear a leader.
What we do from now is not really based on the apology. What we do from now is based on wanting to walk together with Aboriginal people into a future that's good for them and it's good for us. I
think you're right. It was so rare to hear a leader saying sorry in such a sincere and positive way.
That's right. And it was that word that mattered. I mean, it was one of the cartoonists, and it was very clever. One of the cartoonists, I can't remember which paper it was, but there was a cartoon in one of the papers that had Kevin Rudd and the bubble, coming out of his speech, and it says blah 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 blah, sorry, blah 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 blah, sorry, blah 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 blah, sorry. I mean, the blah blah didn't actually matter at all.
Just that one word.
Just the fact that he mouthed the word that everybody, wanted to hear. And I was on the lawns of Parliament House with all those people of all races and kinds in Australia, but certainly lots of huge numbers of Aboriginal people, and they were weeping,
yes,
to hear the word said.
One last topic for us to explore, John, before we let you go. We know you've spent a lot of your life involved in Bible translation, translating the scriptures from Hebrew and Greek into Aboriginal dialects. And I think I'm right in saying the first complete Creole Bible was released just last year. Is that right?
That's true. Yes.
How does it make you feel to see that sort of thing happening?
I think it's a wonderful thing, and I think it's a wonderful thing for the Aboriginal people who wanted it so much and who worked so hard to make it happen. I mean, I think today people need to realise that Bible translation is being done not as a kind of proselytising, but it's being done because Aboriginal people want it done. And it's being done not just in the name of God and Scripture and so on, but it's being also done in the name of equality. Why should Aboriginal Christian people, for example, why should they have to read their Bible in the language of the conqueror? Why can't they read the Bible in their own language if they want to read the Bible? It's according them an equality with the rest of us who have the privilege of the Scriptures in our own language. I mean, I've never forgotten it burns in my mind all the time. I remember my father who started to translate the Bible into Nungabuyu in the Gulf of Carpentaria in the 1930s, and of how the people made him read it every day, and he used to read it by the campfires all night, and they'd say, read it again, and read it again. And of the old man Marty, the leader of the Nungabuyu people, who went hundreds of miles north and brought these other people down to hear what he called that good story. And he said to my father, now I know that Jesus speaks Nungabuyu.
Wow.
And that's a hugely, hugely important thing. God, in whatever form we know or worship God. I'm not really making a Christian point here. I'm making a different kind of point. God is not filtered to us through the language of the newcomer or the invader. And to be able to speak of God, to speak to God, to read and know of God in the language of our hearts, in the language of our land, is a privilege that no people should be denied.
It's a great story that your dad would have loved to have seen come to fruition. John Harris, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for the privilege of sharing this with you.
All the best, John.
Thank you.